Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, researchers have found exploits in popular online game engines, putting both the client and the server at risk. We'll share the details, plus Teracom's epic privacy breach, a recap from BSDCan 2013, your questions, our answers, and much, much more on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 111 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly systems network and administration podcast. We streamed this episode live on May 23rd, 2013. This episode is brought to you by GoDaddy.com, and I'll tell you more about them as the show goes on. And the live stream is powered by the incredible Scale Engine. Go check out ScaleEngine.com. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is our host, the admin, the tech, and the teacher, Mr. Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Hey, welcome back from the big conference. Well, or at least
Yes.
the BSD conference. How was it?
BSDCan. It was great. We'll talk about it in the feedback section.
And you
Lots of fun
feeling
stuff.
okay? You didn't get like a crud or anything like that?
A little bit of con crud, but I'll live.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, we do have a big show. We've got a late start today, so let's hit the ground running, Alan, with our first story. And
Yes.
this one shouldn't make anybody but gamers absolutely worried, right, Alan?
Some researchers from a firm called Revuln have found exploits for a number of popular game engines, and they put both the clients and the servers at risk in this case. So they basically started looking at some different video game engines, like Unreal 3 engine, the Quake 4 or ID Tech 4 engine, and the CryEngine 3, all of which are used by not just those games, right, Unreal, Quake, and Crysis, but used by plenty of other games as well, right? The Unreal 3 engine is built, there's at least a dozen games built on it that I can think of off the top of my head.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like the old Quake 3 engine. The number of games that were built on that was rather ridiculous.
It still is.
And even a lot of games that aren't based on it exactly, are based on modified versions of it. But it means if there's a vulnerability in the original one, it probably means that it descends into all those variants as well.
Yes, of course.
The vulnerabilities work against a large array of games because of the fact that it's common to the engine. The different exploits vary. There's different stack overflows and remote code execution and a bunch of other things. So at the bottom of the article, there's actually a video. And in the later portion of that video, they actually show someone start up a Quake 4 server on their computer. And then from their little tool on a website, infecting that server and causing it to run a command, in this case, just calculator,
Oh, okay.
the Windows calculator. But, that's just a common proof of concept of how they basically made this Quake 4 server run some code that they supplied.
Could have been anything. They just were being
Yes.
nice.
Right. They were just doing it on their own system, so they made it run calculator instead of making it, drop some exploit kit or whatever.
Right.
The bigger worry here on top of everything is that, game servers are a lot of servers out on the internet, generally run by people that aren't the greatest sysadmins, right? They're gamers, not sysadmins.
Ouch.
And they usually have really fast internet connections, right?
True.
Because everybody, the gamers pay a premium to get servers with low latency and high bandwidth and so on. So if you were able to commandeer a big chunk of these servers, you would have all this bandwidth at your disposal to do with whatever you want. They also showed a couple of different denial of service attacks they could do, including attacks against the clients when they try to play the games, on top of, some of them remote code execution again, right? So instead of making the server run some code, they could if they controlled the server, they could make the server cause your client to run code, and install a virus or whatever. But also they spoofed the master server and basically were able to make the servers attack themselves and a bunch of other things like that. And how they could, use it to take out the master server, right? If they could get a bunch of these servers to take out the master server, then anyone trying to play one of these games, when they connect, they wouldn't be able to get a list of the game servers and wouldn't be able to find anybody else to play with.
Oh. Ruins
Right?
everybody's
And
good time.
and a bunch of different things like that. So all the details are there. They have a really in-depth research PDF that has, the actual stacks and the vulnerabilities they're actually exploiting if you can, if you're into that level of detail.
Yeah. That's awesome.
But it basically shows that, it's another section of programs that are very popular that we haven't really delved into, right? We've seen people using Java and Flash and so on to take over people's computers. But, there are millions of computers out there with running the Unreal 3 engine. And if you could convince a bunch of those to run the virus, then that's a brand new vector.
And they're generally, like you mentioned in your summary there, they're generally powerful with fast connections.
Well, especially the servers, yes.
Yeah,
or even just the clients.
Well, they're generally going to be nice computers.
Gamers tend to have more expensive internet connections than non-gamers.
With good CPUs and lots of memory.
Yep, exactly. Or video cards if you want to install a Bitcoin miner.
Ooh, now wait a minute. I got an idea. Okay, everybody, we're going to have this link in the show notes. I just want you to download next. No, I'm kidding. Well, it is kind of surprising we haven't heard about this more, and I wonder if it's actually,
it's just something that people haven't done a lot of,
they? Maybe we just don't hear a lot about it
possibly.
Or I don't know. We'll see. I guess we always have to kind of be careful.
in the chat room asked, servers need video cards. And
in
this case, we were actually talking about the clients, but some servers will have video cards, especially if they're doing anything like we're looking at building some servers with video cards to do video transcoding and things like that.
Well, and in the case,
and there are servers with video cards for doing science math.
Yeah. NVIDIA rents out their big old compute cluster.
That you can rent virtual machines, or you can rent Amazon EC2 instances that are connected to NVIDIA graphics cards as well.
Now, Scale Engine, you guys host a few game servers for Jupiter Broadcasting, and you must have thought when you set those up, these are a potential attack vector because maybe there's potential for sloppy code in these game servers. What steps did you take when you set up those game servers to isolate any potential vulnerabilities?
Well, we run the game servers in a jail, partly so that we could give the people we've delegated command of those game servers root access.
Sure.
Right. So that way I could give Rakai root access in a jail, and he could run the game server. But yes, on top of that, allowing me to isolate the sysadmin from screwing with the rest of the server, it also means an exploit for the game would be limited in what it could do.
So that's sort of.
And we also have some traffic shaping rules. So if they tried to launch a denial of service attack from inside that jail, they would be limited by our traffic shaping.
I should do a obnoxious and obscene plug, but it's something we've gotten a lot of requests for in the show because we talk about jails frequently on the TechSNAP program. And you've come on the Linux Action Show before and talked about jails and kind of explained what they do on the Linux Action Show. And we've got so many emails into the Linux Action Show account asking me to cover Linux containers that this last Sunday's episode that just came out, the one that's already out, season 27, episode 1, covered Linux containers and a software layer that sits on top of them called Docker that makes them easy to set up. So if you're curious about containers and essentially Linux's answer to jails, in a sense,
right.
Go watch that.
Docker software, have you used it much?
I played with it, on and off for the show.
Having played with it, how does it compare to Warden, the PCBSD tool for managing jails?
Warden's GUI got a GUI for one, which is nice, right?
Well, there's a command line version of Warden as well.
I'll tell you what's one thing that's really cool about Docker is it uses a Git push-pull system to push and pull and you can only push if you are a registered authorized user. Right. But the containers you can set up, they have a whole image-based system for them. So I just did Docker Gentoo blah 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 blah, and it pulls down with GitHub, and it like a GitHub-like pull down and assembles the image. And what's cool about it is it can do differentials. So if it's basing one off of the base Ubuntu you have installed, it'll just pull down the components it needs to be a fresh install versus what you already have, and that's neat. And then you can as they're running, you can snap. It provides a lot of facilities to snapshot the containers and then push them to your own repo, so then you could deploy them, which is kind of cool.
Right. Although you can do all that stuff with FreeBSD jails if they're on top of ZFS.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's a different solution, but it's neat. I think they're sort of in the alpha stage still, so it's not really quite ready for production.
Well, it's just at BSDCan I heard a bunch about a new version of Warden that'll be coming out that on top of other features, including more easy to deploy service type jails, right? Like ones with a web server built in and stuff.
Yeah. That seems like an area where Docker's pretty strong right now because you can snapshot and
Warden's
deploy.
had some support, but it's getting better. But the other thing they're working on is the ability to build a jail on a PCBSD system using the GUI, package it up, and then ship it to a FreeNAS box to actually run it there. So you build the service jail on your desktop and then deploy it like a cloud image or something onto your FreeNAS, which is your server with all the storage and all the
Oh my gosh, that's
power.
so cool. I would very much like that as a FreeNAS user. I would very much like that. Right now,
I
mean, that would probably change.
Who's building it?
See, that would probably change my whole setup because right now I run FreeNAS just as the ZFS data store, and I have VMs that sit on servers in front of my FreeNAS box. If I could sit on a PC BSD box and put everything together inside Warden with a Qt application and hit publish to my FreeNAS box, I think I'd probably give up my Ubuntu front end servers.
Pay attention to the next couple weeks because I think that's coming in the FreeNAS version that's going to be based on 9, which again is coming very soon.
Oh man, well that's what's so cool about those guys working on that. All right. Well, should we talk about the story about reporters that were accused of hacking and using wget to download files via Google search?
Yes, because apparently that's a hacker tool.
wget has been, as I put in my tweet, it's weaponized now.
Yes. So some investigative journalists from the Scripps Howard News Service, which is like a wire service basically, were investigating Teracom and Yourtel America, which are these companies that participate in the U.S. government's Lifeline service, which basically provides inexpensive or subsidized telephone service to low-income families.
Okay.
So that they can have phone lines to, have a phone. While they were researching, they did some Google searches, and the journalists found records stored on a server that happened to belong to Call Centers India Incorporated. I wonder what they do. But basically, they found people's applications for the service, which requires a bunch of personal information and a bunch of supporting documents. It turns out that Call Centers India was working under contract for vCare Incorporated, which in turn had been hired by Teracom to verify that people were actually eligible before they give them the discounted phone service. So the phone company that was participating in the government's program to provide phone service to low-income families hired an American company to verify that the people that were signing up were actually entitled to the discount. And they subsequently subcontracted it out to India. And in India, they threw all the files on a web server that was publicly accessible.
Oh, jeez.
And eventually the Google showed up, or the results showed up in Google.
Okay.
So after they found one, they did a slightly modified Google search and basically ended up finding 44,000 applications that people had submitted for this service from like 26 different states in the U.S.
Oh my gosh.
In total, there was like 170,000 documents. But the important thing here is the information that was in these documents, right? It had social security number, birth date, home address, scanned copies of passports and driver's licenses, financial documents and accounts, tax records and stuff, right? Because you had to prove that you were not making enough money to afford a phone line or whatever, right?
Right.
So, but basically all this information in like, I don't know, Word docs and PDF files or whatever.
Spreadsheets
and sitting in directories on a web server that anybody could get on.
It's so funny. And by the way, this is not really, this is not probably the right time to mention this, but I want to reflect on the fact that we have so much hubbub around cybersecurity and locking systems down and setting, like there's a bunch of hubbub right now on a federal standard for the power grid, and it's going to be called the Grid Act. And all of these things that set all these security regulations, and none of them account for this kind of thing, where you have some bonehead that puts it on a public. Yeah.
Yes. So a professional identity thief would only dream of finding this kind of a cache of documents,
trove,
right? Because it's not just someone's social security number and birth date. You have copies of their driver's license, their tax records. Anything you do online just requires copies of these. Well, if you have every one of these already, you can easily, this is all the information I would need to take out a mortgage.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if somebody had all these documents of mine, they could take out a mortgage in my name.
Yeah. And easily set up accounts online, order services. Yep. I mean, it's
all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. And
so the information appears to have just been dumped into web accessible directories on a public facing web server.
And when was this?
That was April of this year.
Oh gosh, yeah, April 24th.
Yeah,
Oh my
is
gosh.
when they started finding it in March, and then April 24th is when they reported it to the phone company. The journalists then used wget to bulk download all the files, right? Because wget is designed to mirror a website, so it can crawl through all the links on a page and download them all. So the journalists then contacted the phone company to report that the data was exposed, and the phone company turned around and they got the files pulled down in a couple of hours. But after that, they accused the journalists of hacking into the system and threatened to charge the journalists under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
You gotta love that response.
Because they were, accessing data they weren't supposed to. And then after some back and forth, Teracom put a statement up on its website called Security Notice. And basically, Teracom claimed that they were the victim of a security breach. Right?
The PR spin.
Into.
The PR spin begins.
Yeah, we were hacked into. It's not our fault. It's like, no, you just left all the files laying around on the internet.
I mean, we left the door open, but it's not our fault they came in.
We talked about this document from the NSA a couple weeks ago, which just described how to do like exactly this.
You're right. That one creepy
do a
document.
search for the name of some government program that requires these type of documents, and add a file type restriction and a country restriction or whatever, and boom, you get all these documents, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we talked about the NSA has a handbook that they published on how to use Google to find stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, we have it linked, I think it might have been the last episode.
109, I think.
Okay, it was 109, yeah.
Yeah. And so in a statement, the legal representatives of the news service said, in the process of gathering newsworthy information, the Bureau accessed via a basic internet search personal and confidential information that apparently is available to anyone with a computer and access to electricity. The search required no special skills and in no way hacked or illegally accessed any servers or databases operated by Teracom or any other company.
I have access to electricity.
Yep.
Wow, Alan. So are they going to get in trouble for this, do you think?
Basically, the way Teracom was talking was that because they don't know that anyone malicious got access to the data, only the journalists, that under the data disclosure laws in about half the states that were affected, they don't have to tell the customers.
Wow. And they have probably no logs.
They kept logs for 30 days of what was accessed on the web server, but
at least we can all rest knowing that this is probably the only circumstance this ever happens, and it's probably not happening ever before or even right now. So nobody worry about that.
Riley points out in the chat room that Teracom is a bad name for the company because it sounds like Terra bad.
Yeah.
But I imagine they meant it more like Earth communication.
So I love the breakdown of events. So journalist alerts them to their problem, which journalist happens to just stumble upon. Then company responds by saying they were breached by hackers and puts out a press release even to that effect, probably partially for legal reasons to cover their ass, and then determines that because they don't have any other evidence because nobody else contacted them to tell them they got access to these files, they don't have to notify anybody.
Kind of. Now, I think the laws in certain states, like I know Massachusetts has very strict laws where the company even has to offer everyone 1 year of credit monitoring service.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've seen some companies where when that, it's a multi-state thing, they basically comply with the most strict one and apply that to all states. But we've also seen ones where, they'll be like, oh, well, we're only going to pay for credit monitoring for the 2 states where we're legally required to. Everyone else can take a hike.
Well, all right. So, first of all, Chris's first rule, don't just have public web directories anymore. Okay, we did that back when everybody was just like on the internet and IP addresses were a new
other
thing.
than
Don't
like
do that
FTP
anymore.
mirrors and stuff, I don't see why you'd have auto index turned on ever.
Why would you just have folders like that open to the web? I mean, that just doesn't make sense anymore.
But also, yes, that's not the way you share files.
Right, yeah. Look at Dropbox. Mega would be a good start. BitTorrent sync is fine too, even. I don't know. All right, Alan, any other thoughts on that story?
Nope.
All right, then let's hit the pause button right here and thank this week's sponsor, GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy, longtime supporters of the TechSNAP program, longer than you might think, because GoDaddy knows that they solve problems for people in our industry. Now, if you go over to GoDaddy.com, look, I'll get you something special, especially if you're getting yourself one of them domain names. There's my girl Danica, just telling you about domains right here. Got your little signature right there. Anyways, Danica wants you to use the code TECH249 when you check out, and you get your .com for $2.49. TECH249 when you check out, $2.49. But maybe you're not going to get a .com. All right? Maybe you're going to take this other nice lady, Alexandra, up on her offer, and you want to get started with some web hosting. Maybe you want to get an SSL certification. Maybe you just want to get something else all entirely. Who knows? I'm not the boss of you.
You'll see. Our next story is about SSL certificates, so you may want to go buy one.
Well, there you go. Then here's the recommendation I've got for you, friends. Use the code GO32OFF3. GO32OFF3 will save you 32% off anything in your cart if it's your first time order. So put a whole bunch of stuff in there, then apply that GO32OFF3. Pow! It's like magic. Look at the numbers drop. Ching, ching, ching.
Yep. Save some money on an SSL certificate.
Why not? So thank you to GoDaddy for sponsoring this week's episode of the TechSNAP program. Don't forget, visiting those links in our show notes just lets GoDaddy know you appreciate them sponsoring the TechSNAP program. Go look what they have to offer over there. And then if you buy, use the code TECH249 or GO32OFF3 when you purchase from GoDaddy.com. Just apply that code during checkout. All right, Alan, so you teased it a little bit. Google's got some announcements regarding SSL certificates, don't they?
It seems more like a
right?
press release and that it's not actually that big of a deal, but anyway.
Yeah.
So Google is basically planning to replace all of their SSL certificates so that all of them use at least 2048-bit keys by the end of 2013.
That's outrageous.
Why?
But, I thought whenever Google does something, that's how I'm supposed to react. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, not in this case.
Oh, okay.
So as computers get more powerful, the possibility of someone managing to crack or factor a cryptographic key grows. So it becomes necessary to basically use longer keys, which use more CPU time on the encryption. But if computers have got stronger, that's at the same time. Slips in the chat room asks if you can use 4096-bit keys. It depends on your SSL supplier, but generally no. Although sometimes you can. It's complicated. Anyway, so basically Google plans to replace all of their 2048-bit SSL keys with stronger 2048-bit, right? So doubling the strength of the keys.
Okay.
Going from 1 kilobyte to 2, or kilobit, but anyway. And they're basically going to start changing on August 1st and plan to have it finished by the end of the year. Although most SSL certificate authorities have not issued new certificates with a key less than 2048 bits in quite some time.
Okay.
The Certificate Authority / Browser Forum published, remember we talked about it, the baseline requirements for the issuance and management of publicly trusted certificates, which is this big long document that basically specified how all SSL CAs should act and which root CAs browsers like Firefox and Chrome should trust. And basically, their document has mandated since 2010 that no certificate issued with an expiration date after December 31st of 2013 can have less than a 2048-bit key. So part of it is that no SSL certificate authority should be allowing Google to have a certificate that's not at least 2048-bit that expires after the end of this year. All right, so every SSL certificate I have is already 2048-bit because no SSL CA would sell me a certificate that was less than that now.
It's because you're a man, Alan.
Well, it was interesting, though, as I was renewing a certificate, it was like, sorry, you need a new key because the requirement is longer now.
Oh.
Right, because sometimes I just reuse the same key, right?
Yeah.
Since it's secure. Although sometimes I will just, it's like, well, there's no reason not to generate a new key just in case. So in addition to that, the NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, made a statement about RSA keys a while back. Google is not a publicly trusted certificate authority. They buy their certificates from one or two or three companies, although we'll get to that in a second.
He's responding to the chat room.
Sorry.
Random.
I forget that I need to say that. So NIST published a thing in 2010, publication 800-57, recommendations for key management. And basically, they advise that a 2048-bit key is no longer good enough as of 2010. And advise moving to 2048-bit RSA keys. Now, this is for general encryption, but it also applies to SSL certificates. So, that was more targeted at things like GPG, like your email encryption or file encryption, right? The NIST sets the standards that, the US government uses for encrypting top secret information and so on. Anyway, the NIST says that they believe a 2048-bit key should be viable up until 2030. That might be a bit optimistic, but, it's not going to change again anytime soon. So on Google's site, they actually talk about a couple things that I think they're worried that some people or devices do that will break as part of this change, right? So the first thing that you should not do is match the certificate that you see from Google against a hash, right? So basically, you go to Google once, you find out what the certificate is, you hash it, and you build that into your little embedded device, and have it just rather than having to make it understand the SSL certificate root trust and chaining and all that stuff, which is rather complicated to implement, especially on a little embedded machine. You just say, hash the certificate. If it's the hash we expect, then that's the real Google. Obviously, that'll change when Google changes all their certificates, right? So definitely shouldn't be doing that. You should also not match against any other certificate, like, just checking that the root certificate hasn't changed. Because the root certificates do change every once in a while. Not that often. They usually have an expiration date 10 plus years in the future to avoid browsers that enable the trust. If a root CA certificate expired in the browser trust, that would be a giant pain, right? But if you tried to use Internet Explorer 4 on Windows 95, a fresh install or something, I bet most of those certificates are expired now. But anyway, also you shouldn't hard code an expectation about the root certificate, especially in like firmware for a phone or other embedded device, because that's usually done based on an assumption like the root certificate in the Google chain will not change without a long amount of notice.
Right.
But that's not necessarily true. Also,
I see.
You shouldn't assume that Google is always going to use the Thought or Equifax as its root CA, because they use both, and they may very well be willing to use somebody else at any time.
Right.
Right. So you should never assume that Google is going to use any of a small number of root CAs, because Google may become its own root CA, right? And then they wouldn't have to pay people. You also shouldn't assume that the certificate will contain the exact expected host name in the common name field. Basically, a root certificate has a common name field that can only have one value, and that's the name of the website. And normally you check, the domain versus that common name value, and if it's anything else, you get an SSL warning. However, certificates for a while now have had a SAN field, which is basically subject alternate name, which is other names that are also correct, right? Like before, when you got an SSL certificate, if you got a certificate for www.jupiterbroadcasting.com and somebody went to the site without the www, the name wouldn't match exactly, and that would throw an error, right? So now they have the SAN field where you can have a comma-separated list of a couple of domains. That way, you don't get the error unnecessarily. So you need to make sure that your implementation supports that as well. Also, they recommend, it's not a requirement, but they recommend that you support server name indication, which is basically a solution to the problem of requiring one IP address per SSL certificate. Basically, when you're doing regular SSL websites, the way HTTP works for having multiple websites on one IP is, as part of the request for the page, you also send the name of the website you're trying to load, right? Like www.jupiterbroadcasting.com. That happens in an SSL setup, though. That happens after the certificate has already been sent, right? Because it comes encrypted, right? The request is encrypted. And so the web server doesn't know which site you're asking for until after you've already negotiated the certificate exchange. So it can't decide which certificate to send you based on the name of the website you're trying to go to. Right? So that stopped you from having two websites on the same IP address that both have SSL. Otherwise, you would get this warning because whatever one was first would take priority. Anyway, so SNI, or server name indication, is this little protocol that basically, as part of the SSL handshake, says this is the name of the website I'm trying to load. So the web server can then send back the right certificate. Google uses this, for example, at googlemail.com, which directs you to mail.google.com. So basically, that's one of the sites where they didn't bother buying a separate SSL certificate for it. They do SNI. Currently, SNI is supported by all modern browsers, except it doesn't work on Windows XP.
Is that modern?
Basically, it's been that way since before Windows 7, and Microsoft just didn't feel like backporting the SNI support into Windows XP for one reason or another.
Well,
yeah,
it's interesting to watch how Google goes through this process. It's not like it's
they have to
not like
announce
it's super
it ahead of time.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
well,
what I was
it's
going to
like
say. It's not like it's a super major change, but there are people that have built products and services around these things that are going to have to update their products and services.
Yeah, or an interesting talk at, or just something I overheard in the hallway at, or I think it was at lunchtime at the Dev Summit.
Yep.
Was somebody talking about, at one point Google had blocked ICMP ping to google.com.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right? Because it's just the amount of pings they get at any time is ridiculous. But how many people's server monitoring did that break? Because the way they monitor that your internet is working is by trying to ping Google.
It's the first thing that comes to mind. Yes. They should be happy. They should celebrate it.
But a lot of servers have automated tests where they check if their internet is working by pinging Google. If they can't ping Google, they assume the internet's down.
Poor Google. And now you can.
So Google ended up having to re-enable it as a public service, basically.
Yeah, and they must have a sophisticated way to handle it. I wonder how many pings a minute they get.
A lot.
One ping only.
Yes, I made that reference when I heard it was in the Hackers Lounge, actually. And I remember it as one ping only, Vasily.
Yes. Nice, Alan. Good man.
Yes, there was much laughter.
All right, so of course, we've got more information in the show notes. Go to jupiterbroadcasting.com, look for episode 111, and then just scroll down past the video, past the download links, and right there you'll find everything that Alan has outlined in copious details with links to the referrals. Alan, was there anything else you wanted to cover in the news segment before we roll out of here?
No, that's it for the news.
All right. You know what that means then? It's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to TechSNAP at jupiterbroadcasting.com or popping that contact link at the top of our website, or even better, starting a thread in our subreddit over at TechSNAP.links. What is it? Just go to Reddit/TechSNAP.
Links.techsnap.tv.
All right, Alan. Well, I thought maybe instead of just jumping right into the emails, we've got a lot of people asking in the chat room. I've been curious. You teased at the top of the show. You talked a little bit about BSDCan. How was the trip? Tell me a little bit about it.
It was great. I was there a couple days before the conference for the FreeBSD Developer Summit, which I got invited to.
Cool.
So I got to see a bunch of more behind-the-scenes stuff and just contribute a bit.
Well, that's cool.
Especially the documentation stuff I'm working on. Adding some stuff to the FreeBSD
Did you
handbook.
take on a big chunk of documentation, Alan?
Well, I promised to do that in November at MeetBSD, and I actually wrote 2,800 words on the train to the conference.
You took a train?
Contributed them. Yes, I took a train.
How was that?
I had Wi-Fi and power the whole way. That was definitely an advantage over an
And
airplane.
did the Wi-Fi work okay? Like, could you have done Skype calls?
Probably not. You get capped if you use more than 75 megabytes.
Because I was thinking about taking a trip and seeing if I could do shows while on the train. Wouldn't that be cool? But all right. So anyways.
But, also, the train took 4 hours. Where flying home only took 1 hour.
Yeah, I know.
But it wasn't bad.
How did the streaming go and all that kind of stuff? Did that work out okay?
The streaming could have been better. We just used webcam, so it was not great, but it was something. Luckily, the guys from FOSS LC, which is they go around and record open source conferences. They have proper recordings with the slides. They have a little. They put a VGA splitter between people's laptops and the projector.
Oh, very good.
They took a copy of the slides and they captured that. And
very clever.
They had their own mics. And very nice production quality stuff. Those should be up in a week or two, maybe less. You can watch their site or YouTube, or I will definitely highlight them on TechSNAP when they come out.
Awesome.
Yes, because they have all the talks.
It's funny how these conferences have such a lag, and I mean, as somebody who creates video, I fully understand why.
In this case, they're basically volunteers.
Yeah, well, that too. That helps too. Yeah.
Yeah.
If they ever wanted to hire Jupiter Broadcasting, though, we'd come out there and bang that out the day the conference is over. Everybody could watch the videos. I'm just telling you, it's how we roll here. It's how we roll.
Most of the people that do the actual recording and stuff and then go to the conferences, they basically volunteer to do it because they get a free trip to the conference.
Oh, nice. And you gave a talk or several talks?
I gave one.
And how'd it go?
Very good.
Nice. And that's going to be online?
I also saw some really interesting ones.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
Kirk McCusick, who basically invented UFS, the original file system for BSD, and was fundamental in like everything that's ever been done. He gave a talk, basically an overview of security in the FreeBSD kernel, and it covers everything from like file system permissions through how jails actually work, mandatory access controls, which is this other system, and then gets even down into the level of Capsicum, which is a new application sandboxing thing that's being worked on.
Oh, that sounds cool.
At the University of Cambridge. And so it's a really good overview of everything from like FreeBSD secure levels that were invented in like the early 90s through the newest stuff that's still being worked on now. And then a talk I missed but was interested in was using NetBSD to build a radar to track a rocket launching center. Yes, a NetBSD-based radar in a rocket launching center. It sounded very interesting.
Yeah, that's one. That's a claim NetBSD.
What did you do to make BSD more interesting? Rocket launching.
Yeah.
I was in a different talk at that time, learning about how to do benchmarking properly. Common gadgets to watch out for, and how not to be phoronics, and so on and so on.
How did they actually say that?
Yes.
That's that poor guy. Yeah. Well.
And then after that, I saw a talk from PJD. He's the guy that ported ZFS to FreeBSD. He has an appliance I've talked a little bit about before, but basically it's for auditing your contractors.
Oh.
Basically, it sits in front of your network and basically acts as a gateway for remote desktop, VNC, SSH, and a couple other protocols. So basically what it does is when you want a contractor to connect to your system,
oh my gosh,
they log into that box over SSH, and then once they get authorized, that box logs them into your server, and it basically records every keystroke, everything they send back and forth.
Of course.
So you basically have a thing you can replay of exactly what the contractor was doing.
Okay.
And it's stored in ZFS on top of the FreeBSD disk encryption.
So I've always thought that would be the ultimate way, like, because some of my clients, I do all remote terminal server into using Windows terminal services, and that has a shadow functionality where you can just remotely watch somebody's session. I always thought, I wonder if they just every now and then just watch me.
Well, this one, it's basically recording everyone.
Yeah, so you can go back and look at it if you need to.
But it's storing them encrypted, right? Because obviously you don't want somebody else to be able to watch these.
That's pretty impressive.
But
how does it do VNC? Does it actually grab the VNC session?
For all three, it intercepts. So basically, SSH, RDP, or VNC into it, and then it bounces into the server for you. Part of the other thing it does is, Windows, you have one login called administrator or whatever, or even on your Unix server, sometimes you only have root is the only user, right? So this way, you can track who is logged in when and who did what. So you can have multiple users end up sharing an account, but this box does the monitoring of who did what, and so on.
That's awesome.
It's a really cool appliance and basically applies all of the security stuff that FreeBSD has.
And just cut about
the Capsicum stuff.
Just cut about 70% of the contractors out there that just cut their rates in half. Just cut their profits in half. No.
Well, specifically, yes, it was. You can tell how much of the SSH time was idle.
Yep. Okay. Good to know. No, it's fine. I would never do anything like that.
You can make a lot of money by selling this device to them as the way to do stuff, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I could be the one that implements the device.
Yeah, and there's another talk, FreeBSD birth to death, basically managing the life cycle of a server from bringing it in, putting it in your inventory system, bringing it online, installing it, and all the stuff through actually decommissioning the hardware and like applying depreciation for the accounting department, and like basically how to interface as a system and how to interface with the regular business part of it and make them happy.
That's awesome.
How to convince them, easier ways to convince them to let you buy more hardware, and how to make them happy when you're getting rid of hardware and stuff. Basically, if you depreciate it properly, all machines are worthless after 2 years, so you can constantly get new stuff. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of things like that. But at the end of the day, there was a birds of the feather session that kind of wasn't really birds, but Matthew Ahrens, who's one of the original inventors or original programmers of ZFS, did a talk where I got to ask him a lot of questions.
Oh, really?
And also, I got this Open ZFS t-shirt.
Oh, look at you rocking the Open ZFS.
He only had a couple of t-shirts, so he started just asking questions to decide who got the t-shirt.
Well, you gave away some shirts too, didn't you? Did you give him one of the TechSNAP shirts?
I'll get to that in a second.
All right.
We're not even on the second day of the conference yet.
Oh, I didn't realize. Okay.
So his first question was like, who has the biggest ZFS array? So it's like, 10 terabytes. So put up your hand, and then as the numbers go up, people's hands would go down, right? So it was like 10 terabytes, 20 terabytes, 30 terabytes. Then my hand went down, and there was only one hand left. It was one of the developers of FreeNAS at the back of the room. He has a 300 terabyte array.
Well, man, now I know what it scales to. Okay.
Yeah, so he got a t-shirt.
Well, he probably
technically
deserved it.
The limit on ZFS is like 1 billion exabytes or something.
Wow, 300 terabytes.
Yeah. Well, that's one of those chassis that holds like 48 hard drives.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even think about the chassis. Yeah. I was assuming it was multiple chassis. All right.
No, that was just, although, yeah, you can use the JBODs to add a second chassis and so on.
Yeah.
And, then was who had the most snapshots? The guy behind me got that one. He had 88,000 snapshots.
Whoa!
He had a mirror where both disks were dying, so he just had it like snapshotting constantly until he could replace the disk, so he tried to lose the least amount of data possible.
Wow. That guy was desperate.
Yeah.
I got him a shirt, though.
Yes. And then I got a shirt for having the most directories.
Oh, really? What was the count?
Giant hash, 12 million.
So were you guys all like SSH'd into your boxes and like checking the stats? Because or did you know that?
I knew that stat because it was on the slides in my talk. I had calculated it a couple days before to put it in my slides.
I mean, that's a geeky crowd where off the top of your head, you know that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So that was day one?
Yes. And day two, they had a bunch of cool stuff. Like there was my talk first thing in the morning, managing FreeBSD at scale using Puppet. Although there was another ISP that was doing video streaming and how they did it. Stefan went to that one, but I'll really interested in watching that one when the video comes out. Adrian Chad, who writes most of a lot of the wireless stuff for FreeBSD, gave a talk about the future of wireless, including mobile, like phones, and also how to do gigabit wireless and stuff. Simon Nielsen, who's on the cluster admin team for FreeBSD, talked about how FreeBSD rebuilt their whole cluster after the security incident. And then Baptiste Darsoun gave a talk about package-ng. And he described a lot of the new stuff that's coming into it. And because I saw that talk and learned a lot, and the other talk about the FreeBSD lifecycle management, my public implementation, as of yesterday, now uses package-ng instead of installing stuff from ports.
Well, look at that.
I have my own package repository where I custom compile like my Nginx and stuff with all the options I want.
Yeah.
Or like rsync. I use a custom patch on rsync that lets me time limit how long rsync will run for. So like if I have a cron job that runs the rsync every hour, I say each rsync job is only allowed to run for 50 minutes so that they never overlap.
That's a very nice thing.
That's not included in the regular binary package of rsync.
Right.
Because it's a custom patch. So I build my own rsync. So I use Baptiste's little tool called Poudrière, which is French for powder keg, which is a play on words from the original FreeBSD one called Tinderbox. But anyway, it lets you build all this stuff and I can have different sets too. So I build one for my edge servers and a different one for my PHP application servers.
That is slick.
Yeah. So yeah, and I basically implemented that over the last 2 days.
Yeah, you were motivated.
Yeah. Well, not really. It was just that easy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, but you're not talking about the most important thing, so I'm waiting.
Yes. And at the the other interesting talk was Tales from the North. Is an ISP, a guy that worked for a government ISP that provides internet access to people like way up north in Canada.
Oh, really?
Right. So they have a satellite head end in Ottawa.
Yeah.
And it streams out to 50 different little shacks in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. So we're talking like almost to the North Pole here.
So,
right?
so instead of going to each individual customer, they go to these endpoints near the customers up in the Northern Territories?
In each little community, there's a shack with a satellite dish that then spreads it out via like not Wi-Fi, but a wireless thing.
Okay.
So basically, if you live within a kilometer of the shack, you can have internet. And they're basically positioned in the little clusters of houses.
Yeah.
All right. And so the difficulty with managing the FreeBSD servers that run these, right? Because if one breaks, you can't necessarily just hop the next plane to the middle of nowhere in the Northwest Territories to fix it.
Right.
So they had this set up with like 2 redundant servers that are running and building their services in jails so they can easily be slid from one machine to the other and
Nice.
like NFS mounts between the 2 boxes. And it was really interesting.
Makes me want to go up to the Northern Canadian Territories and try out the internet.
Well, even when it was time to do it, it was like, the flight would get canceled because of a snowstorm or...
Did you get a sense of what kind of speeds they get and what kind of latency issues?
They get like 256K.
Oh!
Yeah, they don't get much. And the latency is horrible because it's satellite, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
yeah, the latency is like 800 milliseconds.
Yeah, okay.
So I asked them, one of the things is they have a serial console server
Yeah.
that they use to manage these servers. And it's like, yeah, how much fun is it to work over a serial console with an 800 millisecond latency?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, right, I remember that from having dial-up.
Yeah.
I ran my first Unix boxes for a couple of years off dial-up.
Yeah.
And it would have that like 800 millisecond latency.
Oh, yeah.
I got really good at typing stuff and, doing the right number of backspaces in a file without being able to see where my cursor was actually going. And things like that.
All right.
And then, anyway, at the closing session every year at BSDCan, there is a charity auction where they auction off leftover of the swag bags, cool stuff, books people in the community have written, and just anything that they can get their hands on, really, right? Like swag from the different vendors and so on.
Yeah.
So I contributed 3 TechSNAP T-shirts, the last 3 in existence, since there are no more ever to be printed.
Right. The final TechSNAP 100 Patch Your S shirts.
Yes. So yes, those all auctioned off. I think the first one was like $45, and the other 2 were $25 or so.
Oh wow!
Everyone sold for at least double what it sold for on the internet. So.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great cause for the shirts.
Yep.
Did anybody show up wearing a shirt?
The opening session, the conference organizer wore one.
That's awesome.
For the opening session.
The conference organizer was wearing a TechSNAP T-shirt. I like that.
Well, you probably talked to him on Twitter, Dan Lane Gill. He watched like all 100 episodes back to back quickly.
Right.
Yes. So it was him, and so I told him I'd buy him a shirt, and he said he would wear it.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
I also ran into a TechSNAP fan at the conference. And
Daniel,
you're taken with him. Yes. Did you have the picture?
Yeah, I just pulled it up.
Okay. Yes. So on Sunday after the conference, a bunch of us went to a place and had fajitas, and I got my picture taken with Daniel.
Oh, Alan, that sounds like a lot of fun.
He's a FreeBSD sysadmin in Ottawa.
That's awesome. Well, that's a good time. It makes me want to go to these things. Looks like a good crowd too.
Yes. There were 250-ish people. Very
nice. Well, Alan, all right. So why don't we get to our first email?
Yes.
Now, I might hang up on you for a second while I read this and call you right back because your audio's starting to drop a little bit. So stand by while I read this one, okay? So I'll just hang up and we'll do the video.
My audio looks like it's back.
Okay. Actually, no, you do sound okay. All right, I'll leave it. So this one comes in from Gus77. He wants to take you to task. Man, he's ready to throw down. I think I think maybe Gus is angry. He says, Alan seems to think that OAuth is a mechanism for single sign-on. And while
I
it's...
never say that. I did. It was a mistake.
Uh-oh. See, the fight's already started. It's abused as such. It was intended for authorization, not authentication. Yeah, that sounds about right. Now, he goes on to say OpenID is actually a good single sign-on protocol. So there you go, if you want to use OpenID. It conveys authentication, not authorization to your account because it does not overload a service provider with being an authentication provider. It's completely federated, so you can choose who your authentication provider is, so you aren't required to have a Twitter account or an MSN account. You can even run your own authentication server. Now, I think we've actually talked about that a little bit.
Yes, OpenID is the better solution, just nobody uses it.
Right. Yes. All right, moving on.
But yes, OAuth is not for authentication, it's for authorization. It's unclear from the name, but
yeah,
both start with auth. But basically, yeah, it's supposed to... OAuth is for controlling what you're allowed to do, not for proving who you are. Right? So that it's allowing... normally you use OAuth to allow some app to work on your behalf through for Twitter, right? Like you authorize a Twitter client with OAuth to post tweets as you, right? It's for authorization. Whereas some places will use it for authentication, basically make you allow them to use your account as proof that you are the owner of that account, which is not how it's supposed to be used, right?
All right, so the next email comes in from Richard, and he wants to know about using all the cores. He says, hi guys, big TechSNAP fan. You've helped me out tremendously with my job. I work for a small animation company in the UK, and I've assumed the role of general system admin. Everyone else is mostly a Mac user here. We had a need to have a NAS storage for our render farm. After listening to the show, I decided to build a small FreeNAS box with 6 traditional hard drives and 16 gigabytes of RAM running in a RAID Z2. You know, I get a lot of crap for saying Z now. Performance is key and redundancy is important, but not critical. We use it as a temporary storage for working animation and renders. I know exactly what he means. The data is copied to a local user machines upon completion and is consistently being accessed from multiple sources. The performance we achieve is stunning, and the snapshotting is a great bonus. However, we always want more. Is this a best setup for us, or could we have higher performance be achieved for both throughput and latency with RAID 0 with a mirror or another setup? They never really told us what kind of performance he's getting now, but I guess he's wondering about a RAID 0 versus
how he's doing it. Basically, a RAID 0 or mirroring, if he's doing mirroring, which is RAID 1, he would get better read performance. But he wouldn't gain any write performance. If he does RAID 0, which is no redundancy, probably just a bad idea, but you would get slightly better performance, but at the risk of losing your files. So probably the RAID Z is basically the trade-off. You get redundancy and some striping, and basically you get the read and write boost. With mirroring, you get only a read boost. With striping, you get all the boost, but can you trust the drives not to fail someday, right?
He also has kind of a conundrum.
But also, I'm just wondering, how is he connecting to the storage? Is he doing...
Must be Ethernet since he has multiple...
No, I know that it's Ethernet, but is it ZFS? Is it NFS or Samba or what? If it's NFS, okay, well then, yeah. There's a little bit of tuning you might do, but it generally sounds like you're doing just fine.
Yeah.
Right? If you don't have a problem, you probably shouldn't try fussing with it too much. But yeah. You can do a couple different things. Basically, in ZFS, every component you add is striped across. So if you create a setup that has 3 2-disk mirrors, it'll basically stripe across those 3 mirrors. But you'll end up with 3 drives worth of storage, whereas if you use Z2 with 6 drives, you get 4 drives worth of storage. And the RAID Zs will also give you better write performance than a mirror. Because in a mirror, you'd only be writing to 3 drives at once. With the RAID Z, I guess the RAID Z, you're writing to 3 drives at once too. So, but generally, Z gives you better write performance than mirroring.
You know, this next...
But his other question about using all the cores...
Yeah, this next question, he says he noticed better performance. So he says he's got this render farm, and he says that things work a little better if he splits the jobs out in about, where they use 4 cores per task, leaving 4 cores spare. He says he achieves decent results, but then he's not getting all the... he's not utilizing all the machines.
Right. And a bunch of different things. it depends on some stuff. Part of it, like you said, is the problem is when he does too many separate jobs at once on a machine, the I/O becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're reading so many different files or so many places in the same file or whatever that you're just causing the disk to spend all this time seeking instead of working. So you have to kind of balance that across a couple things.
Yeah, and it could. You also have to look into see if the software is efficient across multiple cores because some software,
right? And but basically, you asked about the kernels and their efficiency. From the benchmarking talk at BSDCan, it appears that FreeBSD scales well up to 32 cores, whereas Linux falls off sooner than that, if I recall correctly. But it really depends on your workload. The only way to know if Linux or if FreeBSD would be better than Linux at doing a certain thing would be to try it.
Yeah.
And, that's not always that easy to do.
All right. Should we move on to the next question?
I was just going to mention for package building, Pugier uses jails, and basically by default, it runs one concurrent build each in however. So if you have, on my build machine, I have 24 cores. So it spins up 24 jails and builds 24 programs at once to speed up the build. Although you can also change it so use 10 jails and in each one use 3 threads or something. Although not all programs can be built with multi-thread. But basically, yeah, sometimes the best way to make use of multiple processors is to do multiple separate pieces of work at the same time. But eventually, disk I/O becomes a problem, and that's why the build system for FreeBSD has the option to run on a memory file system, TempFS, where basically it is everything in RAM. Although that requires that you have enough RAM.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, their build machine is like mine, 96 gigs of RAM. So, you can afford to use a bunch of the RAM as a file system.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't have the I/O problem. With video, probably not as helpful. I'm sure you can go through 96 gigs pretty easily.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Yeah, the best you could do is just really large read and write drives, pools maybe.
Yeah, and if you have any control over the size of the blocks it's reading and writing, if you could make those bigger, you save a little bit of work on the seeking and so on. That was actually something that the Netflix guys, Netflix Open Connect, basically Netflix is turning into their own CDN instead of paying for commercial ones like Level 3 and Akamai. And they use FreeBSD for that. And so they were at the Dev Summit talking about some of the stuff they've been working on and what they're doing and what they're finding. And, how they're able to currently push about 16 gigabits per second out of one FreeBSD box and how their goal is to get that even higher. And some of the stuff they're going to have to do that. And that had some interesting stuff about, reading in giant blocks of 1 or 8 megabytes and cheating by basically asking to read 1 byte, but with a read ahead of a megabyte. And then once that gets into the FreeBSD's buffer cache, then to read the whole file. Or rather, not to read it, but to use the send file sys control to have the kernel write that data to the socket. And how that was working really well up until they got to the point where they're reading and writing so much data, or reading so much data, that the data is gone out of the buffer cache by the time they go to send it to the user, because they're going through, I think they have 32 gigs of RAM in their boxes, and they're pushing out, how many gigabits a second. So things are going in and out too quickly. So yeah, their talk was interesting as well. I don't know if the slides for that are available or not.
All right. Ready for the next question, Mr.
Yes.
Jude? The next one comes in from the distractingly handsome Glitter Gulch, and he asks, how's Beehive coming along? Did you hear anything at BSDCan?
Yes, quite a bit, actually.
Oh, good.
So Beehive, for those who don't know, is basically it's a BSD licensed hypervisor. So it's basically a program to replace something like VirtualBox or VMware or Zen or whatever, and to be BSD licensed, meaning you can make an appliance out of it without having to worry about violating the GPL or some commercial license agreement. It originally only ran FreeBSD on top of FreeBSD, although at the Dev Summit, which was the 2 days before the conference, one of the developers talked about some improvements they've made, and basically now using a really crazy hack with Grub, they now have it booting OpenBSD.
Uh-huh.
And another person contributed some code to use UEFI to manage to get it to boot CentOS.
Oh, okay.
So as that improves, you'll be able to run CentOS in a virtualization on top of FreeBSD using Beehive. One of the biggest things about Beehive is basically legacy-free, meaning it doesn't ever try to emulate older hardware, right? Like most virtualization, like QEMU and VirtualBox and so on, work based on this idea of let's emulate, really, really old network card that everybody knows how to support.
Right.
And because of that, there's some performance problems that you end up with.
Right.
So Beehive is based on the idea of not having any of that old clutch in it, and basically so it'll only run if your machine supports extended page tables, which is like the second phase of hardware virtualization.
Okay.
So you have to have a rather new processor in order to do it. Not just support for hardware virtualization, but also for basically having the hardware virtualization also take care of some of the memory stuff. But yes, I'm looking forward to that continuing to get even better.
Yeah, totally. All right. Next.
And so, yeah, I linked, in addition to the talk at the Dev Summit, which I have the slides for, there was also there was actually like a talk during the conference about Beehive, and it includes a bunch of example scripts and stuff.
Okay.
So they've, have some pre-built images and lots of cool stuff you can do with it. Actually, in the hacking lounge, we were playing with it. Basically, I helped the guy that writes the scripts get it so that you can run FreeNAS and pfSense inside Beehive. Mostly for the developers to be able to test and work on it, but also for him to show off in his presentation.
Yeah.
But we did some under provisioning in ZFS. So we basically created a pool that was actually just a file sitting on his laptop hard drive, right? Because when you do ZFS, normally you get whole disks to work with, but you can create a pool where the only backing is a file on your regular file system.
An image file?
Yeah.
Kind of thing? Yeah.
So basically, we created a 10 gigabyte image file.
Okay.
And then on top of that, we created a bunch of ZFS volumes that were each like a petabyte.
Okay. I love that you can just do that even though you don't have the space.
There's some hacking. Normally, ZFS does a reservation saying, I need at least 2 times the size of this volume in space, right? Because of the copy on write. So it takes away 2 times the size of the volume in free space from the rest of the pool so that it's always guaranteed to be there for the volume. We did a little hacking when we created the volumes to say only reserve 1 megabyte of space for this volume. So what that means is when that 10 gigabytes of actual free space was full, any attempt to write to these volumes would have thrown an error, which is not what you'd normally want. But it meant that we created a FreeNAS setup that had like 8 1 petabyte drives in it, just to show off. But one practical use of that is, when you're creating virtual machines, a lot of times you don't know how long you're going to end up using it and how much space you're going to need. So with this, you basically create the disk image and say, oh, it's a petabyte, but only make it actually take up the amount of space that it requires as I write to it, right? Like that's, I think, the default in VirtualBox, right? You create a 20 gigabyte disk image, but it starts out being like 100 megabytes, and then as you write more and more data, it grows. So basically do that because unlike your traditional RAID setup, with ZFS, you can add more hard drives later, and that free space becomes available immediately. So this way, he could, it was an example of how you could do thin provisioning in order to create volumes that are actually bigger than the amount of hard drives you actually have. So it was an interesting experiment in the Hackers Lounge at 1:30 in the morning on Wednesday night.
No wonder you got sick. Jeez Louise, Alan. On top of traveling. Are you ready for the next question?
Yep.
I think it's Piotr. I'm not sure how you say his name. He writes in, he says, have you guys heard of this Port Knocker software? And he gives us the URLs to the Port Knocker project. He says it listens at the link layer for a specific sequence of ports that can be knocked with TCP or UDP packets. And if that sequence matches your config, it'll then do something on your box, like open up the SSH report or run something on the machine. The best part is it runs on most platforms, even on Windows. Pretty awesome idea. You have the script, run a sequence after a port knock, and Bob's your uncle. Thanks for the great show, guys. You ever play with Port Knocker? I mean, obviously, I'm sure
I've
you've
never
heard of it.
used it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, me
Basically,
too.
what you can do is deny access. You basically firewall off your SSH port, and then have, when you receive the sequence of knocks, then you allow the IP that did the knocking to SSH in.
I think I've actually covered it on last a long time ago.
Yeah,
And it's not like, don't think of it as really security so much as it's one layer maybe. I mean, it's nice that you can have a service off and then on a certain sequence, it'll then turn the service on. I mean, I like that.
Yep. I've considered trying to build something like that before to do something like reboot the box. So like when the box will answer pings, but you can't SSH into it.
Yeah.
Or when it's like hung in somewhere, if you could do it like a UDP port knock on a certain sequence and make it reboot itself that way, that might be interesting. But yeah, I've never actually used port knocking, but I've heard of it and understand what the basic concept is.
Yeah, it's neat. And we got a link to the project if you guys want to check it out. All right, next email comes from Sen. Man, is he in a tough spot. And I totally feel him, too. He says, "Hi, Chris and Alan. I'm hosting a game server, and I have the following problem. The game client server authentication is done with SRP3 and uses SSH, not SSH, SHA1. Boy, I got SSH on the brain. It uses SHA1, pass and salt, which is not very safe. I would like to use bcrypt instead, as Alan's talked about how great bcrypt is, if I understand our SRP correctly. He says, both server and the client need to use the same hashing algorithm if I'm following, and the game client is not open source. The server is, but does that help me if I can't change the client? How can I improve the security of the passwords in case the database ends up getting hacked? Keep up the good work. Thanks."
Generally, right. I'm not that familiar with the secure remote password protocol.
I would say that if you can't change the client, then you're not going to be able to change what it uses to talk to the server.
Although typically with regular password hashing, only the server needs the algorithm, right? The client sends an attempt, but I'm guessing since it's not connecting over SSL, they use SRP to basically encrypt the password ahead of time.
That would be the
right. So basically,
if that does that, you're screwed.
So yeah, basically, yeah. If you're using SRP, which I don't know about.
So we don't know. So that would be if it's using SSL and then the hashing's happening on the server side, you might be able to do something there. But if it's happening on the client side, you're kind of screwed. And what I wonder then is if maybe he should pivot from how do I modify the client and server to how do I take steps to insulate myself from this vulnerability.
Right.
Like, make sure all your backups are encrypted, obviously, because a lot of times an attacker is going to go after one of your backup files. That's a real pain in the butt situation where they've open sourced one end of it, but don't open source both ends. It doesn't really help you. You would wish what software makers could even do is just modularize those components out and open source those modules. And then in this case, it would help him. Sen, let us know what you end up doing. Curious about how you solve this problem. All right, Mike writes in with a PF Sense question. He says, "Chris and Alan, love the show, been a long-time viewer. He fell behind a little, so he's in catch-up mode right now, and he just watched episode 92. And guess what, Alan? We were talking about FreeNAS. He said, Alan stated he uses a FreeNAS box as his router as well. And what about running...
I never stated that.
Yeah, I thought so too. What about running ZFS Samba on pfSense? I'd imagine this would work pretty much the same. What are your thoughts on pros and cons on this setup? Thanks again for the shows and the persistent uptime."
Right. It depends on how you do it. But basically, at home, I had a FreeBSD server, vanilla FreeBSD, that I used as a router and a ZFS server. Then I transitioned to having the routing portion be done by a dedicated pfSense box because I wanted to be able to reboot the other box when I needed to.
Right. That is nice.
FreeNAS doesn't really have any routing stuff in it. No. However, if I haven't read the article yet, but BSD Magazine just published a thing about how to build a firewall in a jail using vImage, which is a network virtualization. So basically, you could run your PF firewall in a jail on the host system. That may be able to be adapted in some way to let you have firewall as a plugin jail on FreeNAS. So basically, where you could deploy a firewall into your FreeNAS box as a jail, as a plugin. That's not quite ready to be used yet, but
and I'm trying to just think through the logic of it here. So if I have a device that is on the edge of my network, exposed to the internet, is that the place I want to make my file server?
Not really, no.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. So
But basically, it comes down to if you're at home and you only have one device and you need it to do everything, then maybe you need something like this, right?
I almost at that point would prefer to do two separate VMs, a file server VM and a pfSense VM on one physical
Although
box.
if you want your file server to be fast, it probably shouldn't be a VM.
Yeah, maybe don't virtualize the disk or
But
something.
yeah, at one point, my setup was a Windows box with pfSense in a virtual machine bridged to the two network cards, and pfSense was the router, even though it was running in VMware Server on top of a Windows machine. But in general, pfSense by default, the way it installs on a hard drive, has these two partitions to allow it to upgrade itself and so on. And basically, it doesn't have a big file. It doesn't really have any storage by default, just a little bit. So you could, I suppose, if you did everything from the command line, build a file server into it. But pfSense uses an older version of FreeBSD at the moment. It's like 8.1 with the security patches. I think they're transitioning to 9, but even then, basically on pfSense itself, the ZFS support wouldn't be great. And also, they don't really give you access to the packages. So like they use kind of customized packages. So it wouldn't be very easy to install like Samba to share the files off a pfSense box.
Right.
So in general, I wouldn't try to do both on one box if you can avoid it. If you want to do both, you might consider just doing vanilla FreeBSD instead. But
yeah, that would probably be my
basically,
recommendation.
you're never going to be able to have both GUIs easily.
Oh, that's why
So
he
if you
wants
want the
to
web
do it.
interface, I don't know if that is what he wants, but yes, if you want both web interfaces, that's going to be all kinds of complicated.
Both pfSense and FreeNAS are designed. They are designed with the philosophy
As
where
appliances.
they dominate the box. Exactly, they're appliances. You dedicate a machine to running that image, and they are built under that assumption.
Yeah, but it might be interesting to see a PF firewall plugin for FreeNAS. But, if it doesn't have all the, like you said, it's not a great idea to have your file server be your router. Or your file.
I'm almost, now that I think about it, I'm almost positive there's a Samba plugin for pfSense, a Samba module.
Probably, yes.
Yeah, I bet.
So again, these things can be done, but it's not, as soon as you start trying to make pfSense or FreeNAS do things it wasn't designed for, the advantage of it being this appliance that's good at the things it's built to do kind of goes away.
Yeah, I learned that lesson.
Once you start custom modifying stuff, you start breaking things.
Yeah, that's why I ended up putting machines in front of my FreeNAS box, because I broke FreeNAS the first run through. And I did it on purpose early on out of the gate before I moved all my data over. I tried to experiment. I blew FreeNAS up, and I learned my lesson. And I said, okay, all right, I'm just going to let it do its thing. All right, okay. Alan, that is all of the emails for this week's episode. But folks, don't forget, you can always email the show, TechSNAP at jupiterbroadcasting.com, or go to that contact link, hit it, and then choose TechSNAP in the dropdown. Or do me a favor and just save me some copy and paste. Go to links.techsnap.tv and start a thread in our subreddit. And while you're over there, vote on some stories and leave your comments and thoughts on the links that are in the subreddit, because we always appreciate that. All right, Alan, with the email all done, that means it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. And welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that didn't quite fit at the top of the show. We still want to talk about them, maybe give you some links to read up on your own after the show. And a lot of these links were supplied by our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. And Mr. Jude, our first link in the Roundup is actually one that we would have mentioned last segment, but you found it in between segments.
Yes.
But it's some cool stuff from Netflix.
Yes, Netflix, as I said, was at the developer summit for FreeBSD because their CDN that they build runs FreeBSD. And so we got some cool insight into their hardware and the cool things they're doing. So the revision C of the Netflix server, which is basically ones that they co-locate at like your ISP, so that when you're streaming Netflix, it's not using your ISP's internet bandwidth, just their internal bandwidth. But they also put these at internet exchange points and a bunch of other things. So just to give you an idea of what a Netflix box consists of, it's basically a custom chassis with a Supermicro motherboard, an Intel E5 8-core processor, 64 gigabytes of RAM, 36 4-terabyte hard drives, 6 512 gigabyte SSDs, and then they use 4 separate LSI 8-port LSI RAID cards. Not RAID, but just SAS cards. Basically, by the cheaper ones that don't have RAID because they don't need RAID. Because they actually don't do any RAID. They don't even use ZFS. They just use regular FreeBSD UFS and treat each of the 36 hard drives as completely separate. And if one dies, they just use that much less storage off this box. And then each one also has 2 10 gigabit fiber NICs. And each one of these boxes can serve up to 15,000 Netflix clients and push out 15 to 18 gigabits per second. And they have some nice pictures. But they also have a special revision D. This one holds less, but it's faster. So basically, the box I was just talking about, they put a bunch of those in, and each one will store like a fraction of the whole Netflix inventory. And say the most popular movie will probably be on all 4, so that there's more access to that. But for really popular content, like, for example, they have their own series now. When each time a new episode of that comes out, that's going to be like the most popular thing on Netflix that week. So they have these special ones, which are mostly the same, right? It's a regular off-the-shelf 1U chassis with the same processor and the same 64 gigs of RAM, except for they fill it with 14 960 gigabyte SSDs.
Jeez Louise.
You don't want to know how much that costs for 14 Crucial M5 enterprise SSDs.
960 gigabytes each.
Yeah. And then they use an 8-port LSI card. And then the question that came up during the Dev Summit is, how do you connect 14 drives when you only have an 8-port controller? They use the motherboard's 6 ports to do the other 6 drives. And they have quad 10 gigabit NIC. So they have 4 ports. One of them is used for failover, but they used all 3 ports. And with those boxes, they can handle more than 20,000 connections and push more than 20 gigabits per second of video out of it. And then they show a data center here where there's like 2 racks half full of these.
Yeah. Yeah, these are cool. I'm looking at the pictures right now.
The amount of money going on there is just ridiculous. Now, the PDF version of the slides doesn't have it, but the version they were showing at the conference, actually, the structured cabling picture is a video, and it's a time-lapse of a guy installing all the fiber to connect those 2 racks full of machines. It's like the amount of money you see getting plugged in there is ridiculous.
Cha-ching, cha-ching.
But then they talk about why they use FreeBSD, things they have committed back to FreeBSD. One of the new features of FreeBSD is unmapped I/O, and based on that, they don't hit 100% CPU time anymore while doing ridiculous amounts of traffic. Earlier on in the slides, they have some pictures of what the traffic looks like out of like one of their boxes.
Yeah, and it kind of goes with the pattern you'd almost expect. I mean, it's always busy, but there's definite peaks of like
you see like peaks to like 10 gigabits. These are actually older graphs. You can see they have what's called a loading period. I think it was from like midnight to 3 a.m. each night or something.
Sort of a ramp.
No, you see that all of a sudden it's all incoming traffic instead of outgoing.
Yeah.
When it goes into the negatives, that's actually incoming instead of outgoing.
Gotcha.
So that's when they would load all of the new movies in from the other Netflix boxes.
Right.
Now they've transitioned to just loading the new stuff in all the time. Mostly because even with staggering, they would have a capacity shortage trying to, people are watching Netflix all the time now rather than only during main times. But yeah, lots of cool stuff in the slides here. And they talked about other things that they contribute.
We'll have a link in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's rare. It's super easy to digest. And if you're listening to the audio version, definitely, I showed some of it on the video, but even if you're watching the video version,
and they even talk about how they deploy their hardware.
Oh, yeah?
Like the installer they built and how they call it firmware, but the images they load onto the machines.
Oh, sure.
They have a company that builds the machines for them, and they basically run a special image Netflix created that checks the box and tries to find any faults before it gets shipped out.
Very nice.
And they learn a bunch of other stuff they've learned and stuff they want to give back.
I like that. That's a great thing when you have somebody who's participating in the open source ecosystem.
Exactly.
All right. Well, speaking of finding flaws, The Google engineer, this sounds like a story we've covered before, but believe it or not, it's a new one.
I think it's the same Google engineer, though.
I think so. This guy's got a bit of a rep now. He has, his name is Tavis Ormandy, and he's an information security engineer at Google. He details vulnerabilities in Windows 7 and 8 that can be exploited by local users to gain escalation privileges. And he says this is, of course, one of these situations where it's he says, she says things, but it appears that he's taken the full disclosure approach, stating he doesn't, and I quote, have time to work on silly Microsoft code, and he would prefer to have them fix it themselves. So he's disclosed the whole thing instead of going through the standard vulnerability disclosure process.
Normally, you would have what's called responsible disclosure, where you would tell Microsoft ahead of time and eventually publish it once Microsoft has a fix out. This engineer has kind of a reputation for doing this a couple of times, where he doesn't give Microsoft very much time or doesn't give them any time.
He claims they're hard to work with. Other people have come to Microsoft's defense and says, actually, they're not so bad to work with. They've kind of got a good system.
But the people that came to the defense are working like antivirus companies.
Yes.
So they have this relationship. They talk maybe to somebody specific.
Right. They have an existing,
Microsoft. Whereas this guy's having to do it, is just some guy, basically.
Yeah.
But also, this isn't that critical of a bug because it requires you to be logged in as a local user to exploit it. I can't just do it against your machine remotely.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But basically, he basically said, I don't have time to deal with Microsoft. I found this exploit. Here's all the details. They'll have to fix it whenever.
All right, Alan, you want to cover this story about the charges filed in the bank heist?
Yes. So
cyber bank heist.
2 weeks ago, when we did the double episode, we talked about this one where they basically hacked into some banks in the Middle East, like I think it was the United Arab Emirates or something, and they basically modified a bunch of prepaid debit and credit cards to have a lot more money on them than they actually did.
Right.
And then had teams of people go around to ATMs and just withdraw as much cash as they could.
Like 45 million.
Yeah, they managed to cash out 45 million across 36,000 separate ATM transactions in 24 different countries. So they basically emptied a bunch of ATMs and ran off with the money. But I think 5 or so people that were doing it in New York have been charged. Of course, the ringleader was murdered in the Dominican Republic a couple of weeks before this all came to light. But
4,500 ATM transactions were conducted in approximately 20 countries around the world.
That was the first one where they only got $5 million. Then they hacked a second bank and did it for $45 million, where they did a lot more.
All right, Alan, I got a story for you that comes out of Google that's pretty interesting. And we covered it on the TechSNAP show. Now we finally get more information about it. Hackers who breached Google in 2010 accessed the company's surveillance database. Hackers who breached Google's network obtained access to the company's system for tracking surveillance requests from law enforcement. This is according to a news report. The database contained years of information on law enforcement surveillance orders issued by judges around the country. The hackers were hoping to discover if law enforcement agents were investigating undercover Chinese intelligence operatives who were working out of the U.S. Now, remember, Google was one of the first companies that came out and said, hey, we've been hacked by the Chinese. And then, of course, lots of companies come out and said that since then. Back then, it was suggested that perhaps Microsoft had been breached. Well, we've also got more information about that. Just weeks ago, a senior Microsoft official disclosed that during a conference, he said that, the Chinese hackers had targeted Microsoft around the same time that Google had been hacked. He noted that hackers also appeared to be trying to go after accounts that were used by law enforcement surveillance. I think it's interesting. Microsoft has accounts specifically for law enforcement. What we found was attackers, this is a quote from the Microsoft official, what we found was the attackers were actually looking for the accounts that had lawful wiretap orders turned on. This is according to the senior director of Microsoft's Institute for Advanced Technology and Governments. The post notes that Microsoft's disputed that they were ever actually breached, but it does suggest that it was at least an attempted target.
Yep. So it makes sense that an intelligence agency wants to know whether their people are under surveillance or not.
Yeah. And it's interesting. You must get in pretty deep to go after that type of data, but I don't know. Alan,
you'd have to know it existed in the first place, which I didn't.
I'm panicking. I'm doing an rm-rf/ after this week's episode because of a new exploit for a Linux kernel. You heard about this?
Well, see, instead what you should do is depenguinate.
Depenguinate? That's a word? I think you got to get something catchier than that.
It's a tool. No, it's a tool called the depenguinator.
Oh, my!
And basically, it writes a little FreeBSD bootstrap thing into your swap file and then modifies your grub to boot out of that swap file and allows you to basically remotely install FreeBSD over top of Linux and get rid of Linux. There's a tool Colin Percival wrote. It's called the Depenguinator. It hasn't been updated in a while. I'll have to look and see how useful it would be. But
well, back in April, the Linux kernel developers fixed an incorrectly declared pointer in the Linux kernel. I think we talked about that.
Yeah, so basically, back in 2010, somebody committed a change that added some stuff, and they made this one pointer was a 32-bit instead of 64-bit. And because of that, there was a way that by making a certain system call, you could escalate from a regular user to root. And then in typical Linux fashion, they fixed this in April, and then once the official builds had been updated to use this, then they announced the vulnerability.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things it's a little disjointed on this new. So that original fix still has, they overlooked one potential security implication, particularly the fact that it's possible to gain almost access to any memory area using a subtle event ID pointer. But Ubuntu has already pushed out an update to their currently supported editions. Red Hat doesn't have a fix yet. Versions 4 and 5 are not affected, however, but 6 will have a patch soon. Debian testing has a patch out.
But Red Hat 4 and 5 aren't affected because the kernel's so old it doesn't have the vulnerability in it yet.
Yeah.
It's also funny, though, the reason Red Hat 6 is vulnerable, even though the kernel is an older version than what they list, right? Like the list of vulnerable versions is like 2.6.37 and up through like 3.8. And the CentOS 6 runs 2.6.32, which normally wouldn't have been vulnerable. But Red Hat had backported the change, the performance counter change, that introduced the vulnerability. So they made Red Hat 6 vulnerable by backporting a change into an older kernel.
Yeah, and that kind of caused a bit of controversy. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But basically, this exploit has existed since it was originally written in about June of 2010, but was committed to the main tree in September of 2010.
Okay.
Also, the exploit code that I've seen for it mentions the 2010 specifically, so it seems this exploit may have existed since sometime in 2010.
Huh.
And it wasn't until an automated testing tool found it in April that it was fixed.
You know, Casper wrote into our show, and he has a theory, a conspiracy, if you will. He says, I call it my point of entry theory. So thanks so much for your show. Just wanted to share this article with you, which you've most likely already seen, and he links us to information about this vulnerability. He goes on to say, maybe this explains how some of these web servers affected by CDORT have had their binaries replaced. Pure speculation. Anyways, I felt like sharing Casper. Now, I think this requires local access in order to exploit it, right?
It requires a user account, but you can usually get that on a web server. Like if it's running PHP, if you have some other exploit that lets you get a shell, then you could exploit from like the www user to root. Honestly, if this was what was being used to do CDORT, I imagine we would have seen it on more boxes, just because every Linux kernel from 2.6.37 through 3.8 was vulnerable.
Yeah.
I kind of expect if this was the one being used, it would have been more widespread, but it is possible.
Okay. All right.
Since it to use this exploit, you have to have, the ability to run code. You'd have to use some other exploit in like PHP, in a vulnerable PHP app like WordPress, in order to run the exploit to get root.
Yep, the WordPress.
So it's possible, but who knows?
You
would have to chain things together, and that's what it's defense in depth, right? You have to try to add as many layers as you can.
Let's talk about this IE8 flaw that apparently.
Right. So we talked about this the other week, and it's the one that the vulnerabilities got embedded in some government website.
Right.
Kind of like a watering hole attack in addition. But it seems that this same exploit was used in a targeted attack against the Korean military.
A targeted attack?
I assume they mean the South Korean military.
Yeah, actually...
by the North Korean military, but...
Well, I scanned the article, and doesn't actually say North or South.
Right.
I don't see it in here, but...
in particular,
either way, we know that...
They're both technically, right? It's...
we know that they're not watching TechSNAP, because if they were, we would tell them to stop using Internet Explorer on their official military computers.
Yes, especially 8.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just Chrome or Firefox and stop.
And at least the malware that takes advantage of this IE8 vulnerability, which, by the way, the same vulnerability was used against the U.S. Department of Labor.
Or it was injected into their site to infest people that went to the site. It actually wasn't used to compromise the site.
Five different groups are known to be currently taking advantage of this malware.
There is a patch for this out now, so make sure you install that if you're using Internet Explorer 8.
Yeah. We'll have links for more information.
And you have some reason why you can't stop using Internet Explorer 8.
So
Stop using Internet Explorer 8.
Yeah, seriously. There's a story that's been floating around this week. Curbs on Security ran a great post on it about DDoS for hire.
It's Krebs, isn't it? Didn't we have a...
we got
yelled at about this.
Yeah, we got yelled at. You're right.
Krebs or whatever.
You basically go there, you sign up, you pay with your PayPal account, and you can hire a DDoS.
Yeah, basically this is using that DNS reflection technique that we talked about. And so he did basically an investigation and tracked down the owner of the site and confronted him, basically. And the guy's like, well, it's legit because all the servers that I'm using to make the attack happen are public recursive DNS servers. So if the admins of those servers didn't want them to be used, then they should, fix the DNS reflection attack.
Yeah, he says people can use it as a stress tester, and he's even made.
It's like I don't encourage people to use it as for denial of service, although the name of his site kind of suggests that. Like I forget what it's called. It's
asylumstressor.com, and I guess in an ad he says, do you get annoyed all the time because of S-Kids on Xbox Live? Do you want to take down your competitor servers or website? I guess there's an ad that says that.
Well, in that one, he's being blatant. But
yeah. And
I had this story the other week, but I mostly brought it up because of our next link.
Yeah, so the next part that came out that I just saw on ZDNet this morning, I think it was, the DDoS site where you hire via PayPal also has a deal worked out where the FBI can sit in there and look at the IP logs, look at all the customer records, see who's ordering up DDoS to go, and he's just handing all over to the FBI. So that's why he's able to get away with it. They haven't shut him down yet because he's a honeypot.
Yeah, well, he was talking to the Krebs security guy. Yeah, apparently forgot to say, and this is off the record, but that, I work with the FBI and let them have access to the list of everyone who tries to launch an attack.
Yeah, so when you hear about something that sounds like it's too good to be true, or maybe too bad to be true in some cases.
Yeah.
Well, it probably is.
This is mostly just silly, but...
Now, this next link in the roundup, the last link in the roundup is a certain...
It's a funny video.
It's a funny video. I don't have the audio hooked up today, but I don't think you've ever heard the TechSNAP program say, go check out this video from Ellen.
No.
I never thought we'd say that on this show. But Ellen actually had a very humorous... And if you've been trying to convince somebody about their password situation and how bad it is, you can play them this 3-minute Ellen video. It's very funny about using...
Yeah, it should be an ad for LastPass.
It honestly, I almost wondered if it was. I wondered if at the minute she was going to say, or use LastPass.
Yeah.
Because it's the Internet Password Minder book.
Yeah, so basically, it was based on some infomercial that was on TV where they're basically selling you a book of paper where it's got little slots ready. So you put the name of this, it's alphabetized, and you flip to your Reddit login. You flip to the R page, right, and you write in Reddit, my username is this, my password is this, in a little book. So it's like, well, so anybody can open this book and look at your passwords, right? So this is based on the idea that you're the only person that uses your desk or whatever. And so maybe that's a good enough security for you, whatever. So Ellen's solution was the book was called the Internet Password Minder.
Yeah.
So she designed the Internet Password Minder Protector, which is a wooden box. You put the book in and it has a combination lock on it, right? So that you can keep the book safe. But if you have this book, you probably have a bad memory and won't be able to remember the combination to open your Internet Password Minder Protector.
Right.
So if you order now, you get this tiny little thing. It's your Internet Password Minder Protector Minder, which is a little book that you write the combination in so that you can unlock the box to get the book that has all your passwords in it.
This is the state of our world. Because it kind of rings true a little bit.
Yeah.
Especially for those of us who are a little more challenged in this area. I mean, as somebody who's done a lot of support, I've come up to a lot of desks and I've turned over the keyboard and the password's on a sticky note underneath the keyboard. Happens a lot more.
In the infomercial, they show people having them stuck to the side of their monitor or just loose in a drawer. And yes, having a book is a better way to manage that information, but it also means anybody can walk up to your computer and get your passwords.
Yep. All right, Alan, well, I think that brings us to the end of this week's show. And, and if we didn't cover something this week that you wish we would have talked about, You can do something about that. You can make a difference. Go over to links.techsnap.tv and submit a story to our subreddit. Sometimes they even get promoted up to the top of the show when we really dig into them. And we love comments, insights, voting up and down, all those kinds of things. Help us gauge what kind of stuff you guys want in the show. Also, you can email us, techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com, or pop that contact link and let us know your thoughts, and we'll work those into a future episode. Now, don't forget, TechSNAP is live Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is
4 p.m. Eastern, 2000 UTC.
Boom. Over at jblive.tv for the video or jblive.info for the audio. Then TechSNAP comes out a few hours later over at jupiterbroadcasting.com, and you can subscribe and get it weekly, so that way you don't even have to worry about it. Alan, thank you, sir, for the great show, and thank you to our awesome chat room who showed up live, and thanks to you who've downloaded the show and watched it after we did it, because without you, well, really, we wouldn't even be doing these shows. So really, thank you for downloading. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of TechSNAP. See you right back here next week.